Hey guys, Mikoshi here. Today I'm going to be giving you a guide on how to make a physical to cold conversion tornado shot. This video is going to be for the lower end entry physical to cold tornado shot. If you want to see a min-max cold convert, please refer to my old guides for the time being. Everything is exactly the same, just that the DPS a bit lower because of the heat shiver that was nerfed, but there are practically no changes except the additions of charms. Now for the video, I'm going to go on the overview of the build, explain its gear and the updates. For the build, we're going to be using Omniscience, Tornado Shot, we're going to go physical to cold conversion, and we're going to use the non-rage variant that uses Heat Shiver. So we will be dropping the well-known Warlord's Mark rage setup to go for the Sniper's Mark for that DPS single target. So for the build review, its strength is it's very quick, it has awesome clear, and the single target is massive, especially for a mapping build. It has no real ceiling, which means you can start with a couple of hundreds of divines and you can continue investing mirrors upon mirrors without ever stopping, and it's gonna be equally as strong every time you start investing more currency. It is very simple to upgrade. 99% of the time, it's simply just get a better bow. Now, obviously, I will be making guides on how to upgrade your tornado shot if it's your first time. Don't worry about it, but it is very simple to upgrade. It's pretty linear. For its weakness, it is on the squishy side. However, it is fixed by our DPS. It's the mentality of kill or be killed, and that nothing when it's dead can kill you. Some people have said that they are on death effects, like yes, but most of the time when enemies are dead, well, they can't really attack you anymore. There was a lot of problems with the porcupines monster. When they died, they shot a bunch of physical damaging porcupines. The best way to fix that, by the way, is to use something called Herald Device, because it shatters the enemy, which means he cannot give you an undeath effect. Just a small tip. Now, you might have to be careful on what you walk or click on. I know a lot of people, they like to take their time to read, for example, the altars or their strong boxes, or sometimes, you know, you click somewhere, your character walks into some place that you weren't supposed to be. For example, those circles that are like either white, red, orange, red, or blue. You know, those things that blow up. Now, you have to be careful for that, because that will pretty much instantly kill you. And there will be time that you will randomly die and you won't really understand why. However, if you have a well-rounded character, you won't die as much if you know what you're doing, okay? It's just about practice. If you've never played a tornado shot before, it might take a bit of time for you to understand how it works. But once that's down, I'm telling you, you won't really die as much. Now, it is more expensive to get into the physical to cold than the Trinity tornado shot, especially because of that heat shiver nerf that drops our DPS by 35%. Before, it would simply double our DPS, so you know, with maybe 100 divines, you would be able to reach like very high numbers of DPS, but now heat shiver was finally nerfed, so it's a bit more expensive to get into it, but it's still the best build. Now let's talk about the price. If you already have an Omniscience tornado shot on the, you know, Trinity side, I suggest you enter once you have 150 divines, not lower. And if you do not have a single item, so you're just going in physical to cold conversion with nothing else before, then I suggest you go into at 200 divines, and just a bit more is always better. Now, I used to preach that it was at 100 divines that cold conversion was the best to get into, but really that heat shiver nerf does change few things, so I really suggest you invest. You save up more to go into physical to cold conversion. If you really want to go, you could go at 100 divines. However, I think it might feel a bit worse than your Berserk mapping Trinity setup. Now, what is cold conversion? It's pretty much the end game of tornado shot builds. It offers the highest amount of DPS, and no other variant has ever reached that amount of DPS that it can give. Now, obviously, this has to be paired with the Omniscience. It used to outperform triple elemental or Trinity setups for two main reasons. Converting damage means you can scale both sources of damage to gain DPS, which means you can scale physical and you can scale cold damage. Triple elemental, you can only scale elemental damage, because even if you only scaled cold, well, that would only augment a certain amount of damage, but you can't scale too much of a single elemental damage, because you wouldn't be able to use the best gem support, which is Trinity, right? So you would only be able to scale with elemental damage. The second reason why it would outperform Trinity setups well, even if we did use Trinity with the old cold conversions, is because 100% of our DPS was cold. And so by using the 100% gain cold damage as extra fire damage with Heat Shiver, we would effectively double our DPS. Heat Shiver has been nerfed to a 30% instead of 100, which equals to a 35% DPS drop compared to the older leagues. However, it still outperforms triple elemental builds by a ton, okay? So cold conversion is still king, if you were asking yourself that question. However, it's going to cost you a bit more to get into and to feel better. Achieving 100% conversion is imperative to the build. And to do so, you will need 40% from your cold mastery in your tree, and you need 60% from your gloves. And those gloves are called conversion gloves. So they're very specific. They all look the same because they need those two specific modifiers. We will get into it later. But yeah, they're conversion glove or 60% convert. That's what I like to call them. Now, when you go for the end game cold conversion, which will not be discussed in this video, but just if you really wish to get more into the cold conversion, well, then you're going to go for something called multi-link gloves, which are items, they're gloves with like the socketed gems are supported by, socketed gems are socketed by, blah, blah. So for those, you would need a 40% from your tree, 35% to 40% from your Watcher's Eye, and then 25% from your glove enchant or your quiver implicit. Now, if you're watching this video and you don't have a tornado shot or you've never done this, the average progression for going into cold conversion and tornado shot is you league start. Usually you're going to league start with Rain of Arrows to swap with Lightning Arrow afterwards. Then go for the Trinity Rage setup. I made a 10 Divine budget build for that. Omni Trinity, which is the basic Omniscience build. I went for the Rage setup on a 50 Divine budget. It was very simple. I had 400% movement speed, and I had, I think, 40 million DPS, which was very comfortable to do all the mapping needed. There is also the normal Sniper's Mark setup that doesn't use Warlord's Mark. However, I think for pure mapping, Rage setup can't be really beaten. Then you would swap to the Omni physical to cold conversion. Sniper's Mark is the best. Now, if you went for the Rage setup, you wouldn't be able to use the Heat Shiver, which gives you a 30% more DPS boost. Now, Rage does give you a 44% more DPS boost. However, when you're bossing and when you're doing single target, you do feel the difference of not having Sniper's Mark. Because Sniper's Mark basically increases the damage taken by, with Focal Point, I think it's 47%. So you basically have 47% more damage plus 30% from Heat Shiver. That's 77% more damage, which is better than Rage at 44%. That's the math why I think Sniper's Mark is best. Then Mage Blood, a Mirror Tier Bow to your build, multi-link gloves, and then just go into the Mirror Tier. And then the final best tornado shot is going to go for the Omni Physical to Cold, the All-Seeing version. I made a video about it. It's where we actually use a chest that has 6 Abyssal Sockets, and we just stack Abyssal Sockets. It's completely nuts, but it is like one of the strongest builds I've ever played. That is like league only, that is league viable. It's completely crazy, but we don't talk about that in this video. We're gonna stick to the basic Omni physical to cold conversion. Let's start with the amulet. Crystallized Omniscience basically changes all of your attributes and transforms them into Omniscience, and per every 15 Omniscience you get 1% elemental resistance and penetrate 1% elemental resistance. Now, I've spoken about elemental penetration, all the math in there, so I won't go over it again. But just understand that increasing your penetration is better than increasing your DPS. It is completely nuts. Just think about your defense when you have negative resistance, and people can easily achieve between 1,000 to 1,500 Omniscience, which is between 66 to 100% elemental penetration. And so just think about monsters that have 30% resistance and they go down to minus 70%, how much damage they take. It's completely nuts. It's completely bonkers. It's the strongest. I think it's one of the strongest items in the game. The best annoyance for Crystallized Omniscience is going to be Sovereignty. If you like to run a lot of auras, I like to run a lot of auras, so I used it. Because, well, not everybody has the currency for Enlightens level 5, and you don't want to use your passive points to have mana reservation. So Sovereignty is very GG's. You could go for the multi-shot if you're not missing Omniscience, and that basically just saves you 4 points. Or you could go for the Utmost Intellect or Might. Both of them are the exact same thing. Intellect is strength, Might is... intellect is int, Might is strength, but because it's transformed into Omniscience, there's literally no difference. And if you don't need any of these, I like to go for any of the, plus Frenzy, because Frenzy is just very powerful. It just gives you a lot of DPS. But for me, the best annoyance are these three. For the rings, they are the biggest source of flat attributes. You don't have any excuse of not having 180, at least 180 attributes in total. The classic Omniscience ring is going to be 60 strength, 60 dex, 60 int, maximum life, regenerate mana per second, non-channeling skills have -7 to total mana cost, and then a random modifier. Now, why do we go there? Well, the attributes is pretty simple. They give you more Omni, life, and mana regen. It's a June Unveil, so it basically guarantees it when, well, almost guarantees it when you're crafting them. It's always nice to have flat life, and that mana regeneration is very, very useful, especially when you don't have Mage Blood and your Tornado Shot actually costs mana. And then the last modifier is often just an Exalt Slam, so kind of random. The best one being, in my opinion, flat physical damage. Now, also an important part of those rings is actually the base, right? The implicit. The best implicits are going to be the Chaos Resistance with the Amethyst ring, and then the crit multi. I always forget if it's crit multi or crit chance, but you know, the diamond rings, they're going to be the best two bases. The Amethyst ring being the most expensive. Now, obviously, once you have the currency, you're going to go for the triple implicit mirror tier rings, but we're not there yet. Now, if you do have a good build and it's well rounded, you can actually take off one of those rings and replace it with something called the Death Rush ring when you're mapping. So Death Rush is a pure mapping ring. It is completely broken. It gives you between 3 to 5% life recovery on kill, which is nuts considering we're murdering hundreds of enemies all the time. And it also gives you the buff of Adrenaline for 1 to 3 seconds. Now, obviously, 3 seconds is always better. What does Adrenaline give you? It gives you 100% increased damage. 100% increased damage does not mean you double your DPS. It doesn't work like that. It's like additive, but it's still a big chunk of DPS. And on top, it gives you a lot of attack speed and a lot of movement speed. A lot of movement speed only. I don't remember, but it just makes you zoom a ton and it makes you do a lot of damage. Now, some build can't really run Death Rush because they really need the Omniscience, or they really need the non-channeling skills have -7 to total mana cost, which is very useful because, you know, if you have to wait for your mana regeneration every time you want to attack, that basically just completely bricks your build. So use Death Rush carefully, but if you can use it, it's OP. For the helmet, Heat Shiver is the best in slot. This single helmet just boosts your DPS by 30%. That's completely broken. It's better than Black Sun Crest, even after the nerf in terms of DPS. It's crazy. It's a crazy item, and the best implicit, if you wanted to corrupt it, would be the 90% mana multiplier. That's very useful because you don't really need Enlightens after that. You could just put a bunch of auras in and it will work. However, if you really are too short in Omniscience, for example, your Crystallized Omni is at 15%, except instead of like 20 or 25, so you really need like 1,300 Omni. I usually suggest to change your amulet actually, but if not, and if you really want to stick with it, you have a cool, double implicit corrupted, then you can go for the Black Sun Crest, but I really suggest going for the Heat Shiver. It is so powerful. For the bow, pretty simple. You want the highest physical DPS possible, and then the highest amount of arrows for the budget. The bow attacks fire 2 additional arrows, or 1, is basically what's going to decide how much your bow is going to cost you. But what I do is, depending on my budget, I search for either bow attacks fire 1 or 2, and then I just check the highest amount of physical damage possible, and that's just the bow I'm going to use. It's just the indicator of how much damage you're going to do. Now, you could craft the bow yourself, because I like to tell people to craft their bows themselves. However, I think the bow is pretty much the only item that is very useful to buy from other people, because other people, well, they need better bow because that's how you upgrade your Tornado Shot. So they're going to sell their bow for a bit lower than what it's worth so that they have the divines quickly and buy a better bow, and you can just snatch that. Now, crafting apart, the best things to have on your bow is going to be physical damage, right? So increased physical damage, flat physical damage, highest amount of arrows. You want a crit base, so you want the spine bow and nothing else. You only want a spine bow for physical to cold conversion. It's the only base you want. You want attack speed, critical strike chance, accuracy, and you do not want, for the love of God, to have a single defensive modifier on your bow, like ever. That's the biggest crime you can ever do in bow builds, just in general, is to have defensive mods. The quiver is next. It's even easier. It's just put the quiver in, DPS goes up, quiver is good. Now, if you want to specifically search for modifiers, you want extra arrows, physical, flat physical, crit multi or chance. You want speed, you know, increased damage. No defensive mod except life. Life is the only modifier that I actually go for. Like, I like to have maximum life on my quiver, and it is the only mod that is not purely DPS that I would ever consider to have on a quiver. For the body armor, you could either go for the unique version or the rare. Hyri's Ire is still completely broken. It gives you 30% chance to suppress spell damage, and it gives you a ton of added cold damage, which is good because we're, you know, a cold build. However, if you feel that it limits you or you have enough currency, then it's better to go swap for a rare chest. For the rare chest, you would want to have the hatred effect and the non-curse aura effect as implicits. Those are the two only implicits you want, no other. For the explicits, you want spell suppression, avoidance, mana reservation efficiency, life, chaos resistance, some good stuff. Those are going to be the best modifiers you want on your chest. For your gloves, you're going to want the 60% physical converted to cold damage. You want that with your implicit and your explicit, so the total must be 60%. I don't care how much how you get it, nobody cares. It's just on your gloves you need a total of 60%. So for the implicit, you would go for the physical damage converted to cold, and then you can go for the gain 1 rage with attacks no more than a certain amount per second. Those are very good. Example, if you're running Berserk and you're just mapping and you need that, you know, that little boost of DPS, because you won't be gaining a lot of rage with that implicit. It will literally take you maybe a minute or two of mapping to actually go to 50, so your max. However, you only use that Berserk when you need it. So example, you have a monster that's really powerful. You see a big pack of monster, you need to clear that legion. You pop the Berserk and you're just going to zoom for maybe 5 seconds maybe. And you basically just go 30% faster and deal 44% more damage. That's very useful. For the explicits, the best one is the increased damage with hits against shield enemies. However, it is quite expensive, so it's, you know, not mandatory. You can go for spell suppression. I love it. Attack speed, conversion, of course. Like, you need those conversion as implicit and explicit. And then once you have enough currency, you know, if you have an additional 100 and 250 divines to invest only in your gloves, then you would swap to the multi-links, but that's not for now. For the boots, the implicits, you want avoidance, element avoidance, because you want to be 100% avoid. And then you want action speed. It's rare to get the action speed, so it's understandable if you settle for movement speed, but it's either or. For the explicit, you want movement speed. Your boots should never not have movement speed. If your boots don't have movement speed, they suck no matter what the modifiers are. You don't want any boots that doesn't have movement speed. Then you would go for the avoidance, spell suppression, and life. Now for the extra modifiers, for any of the items, if you have all of those modifiers and you don't know what to add, just add attributes. It's pretty simple. For the belt, if you're with the Magi and you like the tech that I explained in my last video, where we use, you know, Forbidden Right to self-damage and then use the tinctures that give us additional arrows if we've taken damage recently with Dying Sun, it basically gives you a +5 arrow combo at all times. And while 5 arrows to your Tinder shot is completely nutty. So yeah, go for the Warden of Magi to use the micro distillery tech. Now, if you don't want to go Magi, or you know, you have Primalis and you have some very nice charms, then I go for the synthesized attribute implicit belt, or you can go for the Stygian Vise belt. Either or is very strong. And then for the Stygian Vise, what I suggest is your Abyssal Jewel to actually have the modifier that grants you phasing on kill. So I think it's like 4% chance to gain phasing for 4 seconds on kill. Very useful because you can just walk through enemies. And it's just good quality of life and actually just good survivability. For all of the modifiers, you want attributes, life, damage. That's basically chaos resistance. Those are going to be the modifiers on any type of belt that you want. Now, if you do have enough currency, go for the Headhunter or the Midgeblood. There's always this debate between, do I go HH or do I go MB? if you're pure mapping, okay? If you're going 100% deli, 80%, if you're just going deli, anything that just goes deli, you're farming deli, or you're just pure mapping, Headhunter is by far better than Mageblood. It is so strong, it is completely broken, and it is, I think, often cheaper. Now, if you want an all-rounder, so you want massive, you want single target DPS, that's crazy, because you know, when you invest a lot in your build, you actually want to do pretty much all the content possible. So if you want a boss, you want a map, you want to zoom the hell, you want to do some sanctum, all of that, Mageblood is the best option. Mageblood is the best belt in the game for our build. However, just for pure mapping and deli farming, you know, stuff like that, then Headhunter would take over. For the Flask, if you have Mageblood, you go for the 70% increased effect. If you do not, then you go for the enchant. Use when reaches full, right? When the Flask charge reaches full, that's the best enchant. You could go for the reuse when you're bossing and stuff, because you're not getting charges all the time. But I think like that's a very rare occasion that you're gonna run out of Flask. So just go for the use when Flask are full, because you never have to like micromanage your Flask. Best Flask are the Diamond Flask for critical strike chance. Onslaught Flask. Onslaught is very powerful. It gives you 20% movement speed and 20% increased attack speed, and it scales with Flask effect. So if your Flask effect have a 50% increased effect, well, you're going to get 30% movement speed and 30% attack speed. It's very powerful. Onslaught is very strong. Then go for the Quicksilver Flask, you know, because we're a mapping build and you don't want to be slow, because being slow with a tornado shot is, first of all, dangerous for you, and it's a sad thing to see. The rest of the flask can be interchanged. You can add tinctures, you could not add tinctures. I like to add a elemental flask, you know, to cap my elemental resistance, because often at 1200 omniscience, you're not going to have enough to cap your resistance. So you would use like a random, either you run a bismuth flask that gives you elemental resistance, or what I like to do is actually run a chaos flask that gives me chaos resistance, and that has the modifier that also grants you 40% elemental resistance during flask effect. And then I'm pretty much capped in elemental and chaos resistance, and my survivability is very good, and it's a well-rounded build. Also, something that people always forget or seem to never use is to use the spell suppression flask with phasing. If you're not spell suppressed, you can use your flask, okay? Flask are meant to be interchanged depending on what you do, okay? They're not set in stone. Move your flask and change your flask depending on what you're going to farm, okay? I never have the same flask for everything, except when I go into the mirror tier and my build is completely done and there's nothing I'm going to change. Then yes, it's well-rounded. But even then, when I'm doing specific bosses, I will change my flask just a bit depending on the bosses. For example, Exarch, I'm going to go for that ruby flask so I don't take as much fire damage. And that will increase my survivability. So yeah, use your flask according to what you're going to farm and what you're doing in the game. For the tree section, I'm just going to talk. You're going to have the tree in the POBs. It's basically the classic tornado shot. It didn't change, so I don't really like to repeat too much. For the clusters, you're going to go for the 12 passive cluster. Invest in your 12 passive cluster, the best mods being 35% increased effect, 3% increased attack speed, chaos resistance, and life. You can go for also additional attributes, so for example, +8 to int, strength, or dex. And you can go for the 4% increased damage. However, I think that's a bit overkill. For the medium clusters, until you reach 100% crit chance, go for the crit ones, which is quick getaway and pressure points. Go for them until you're crit capped, and once you're crit capped, then you swap to the damage ones, which is eye to eye and repeater. Now, it's pretty simple. Just go for the 40% cold conversion for your mastery, and for your ascendancy, we're gonna go for the far shot, which is 60% more damage, completely broken. We're gonna go endless munition, that gives us +2 arrows for free. We're gonna go for focal point for that, that extra DPS, or you could go for the chain ascendancy instead if you're purely mapping. And then we're gonna go for gathering winds, that gives us tailwind, which is completely broken. It's like if you have 10 gale force, you have 20%. Yeah, that's 20% action speed, completely broken. Action speed is basically you do everything quicker, and yeah, so it's the best thing you can go for. So for the gem setup, if you're not going for the multi-link gloves, you're gonna have a 6-link. Sixth thing being Tornado Shot, you want 20% quality on that, right, for that additional secondary projectile. Awakened Vicious Projectile is completely broken. It gives you more physical damage. It's just pretty much best in slot. Awaken Elemental Damage. Inspiration Support. Inspiration Support is good because it gives you inspiration charges, which is, you know, elemental damage, and it decreases the cost of your skill. Now make sure if you're running Inspiration Support that your Tornado Shot doesn't cost 0, because if it costs 0, you basically can't gain inspiration charges, which means you can't gain damage from it. Now, after that, I like to go for increased critical damage, not critical strike chance. It is better to go for crit multi. And then for the last link, we could either go for Fork, Change, or Mirage Archer. When I'm purely mapping, I go for Fork and Mirage Archer. Fork, in my opinion, well, I like to say Fork is just simply better than Chain. Now I know some people are gonna say, yeah, but you can't aim, like Chain actually jumps to other enemies, which means like in corners and stuff, it's actually gonna hit, while Fork is just in random direction. The thing is, you shoot so many arrows and you shoot so many enemies at the same time. When you use Fork, just all of your screen just dies. So in my opinion, Fork is by far the better option over Chain. Like, not even a question to me. Now, if you are running, for example, Crimson Temple and there's a lot of corners, then maybe you could say that Chain is better. And in my opinion, then yes, Chain would be better for that. However, for anything else, Fork is the best mapping, you know, supporting gem possible. It's completely broken. You could go for Mirage Archer, which is really cool and really awesome because, you know, when you're reading, when you're clicking on things, well, you're not shooting anything, and the Mirage Archer will actually shoot for you. And Mirage Archer hits, like, he hits like a truck. He deals a lot of damage to the enemies, and he can clear packs by himself. So very useful if you know, you don't like to click all the time and having to micromanage when you're shooting. For the second 6 link, we're gonna go for the Sniper's Mark, Mark on Hit, Enhance. Well, yeah, Enhance is not that useful anymore, but you know, it's still there. Blood Rage, Steel Skin, and Berserk. Sniper's Mark, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It's the best curse or mark you can have with your build. Mark on Hit, to automate it, you don't want to cast it by yourself. It's annoying. Enhance, well, you know, Sniper's Mark does have good quality as well as Blood Rage, Steel Skin, and Berserk, so it could help. You could drop it. I mean, I like to drop it and I put a portal gem. It's just like quality of life. Blood Rage is pretty simple. It's the best way to gain frenzy charges when you're just killing things. Steel Skin is, you know, I like to put it on my left click, and I basically have Steel Skin, 30% of the time. So 30% of the time I have a lot more HP. And then Berserk, that I use very rarely, just for that burst of DPS when I'm mapping, or for that burst of movement speed. For the aura setup, I like to run Hatred, Enlighten, Val Haste, and then when I'm mapping, I go for Herald of Ice. Herald of Ice is completely broken when you map. When you kill enemies, you have a chance of you know, shattering them, and when they shatter, they actually deal damage to enemies next to you, which can die as well. So you just see big pops. It's basically like Explode, but for shatter. It's completely broken. Plus, with MTX, it looks sexy. Now, and if you're bossing, sorry, you're gonna swap Herald of Ice for Herald of Purity for increased DPS. It is the best Herald for DPS for Tornado Shot. Now, if your helmet does have, you know, that 90% RMR, you could go for Precision instead of the Enlighten. So you have 4 auras in and nothing else. For the Mana Forge setup, I go for the Culling Strike, which instantly kills enemy when they're at 10% HP or lower. Frenzy, which gives me Frenzy when I'm mapping, you know, just when they hit, it gives me Frenzy. And paired with, you know, Blood Rage, I get Frenzy capped immediately. However, now that we don't have alternate quality with the Blood Rage, when we're just single target, we need another way of generating Frenzy, and well, Frenzy is the best way to do it. Power Charge on crit, so we gain power charges when we crit, which is good to get us crit capped. And then Mana Forge Arrow to automate it all. Now, I like to go for Flame Dash or Mirror Arrow as the movement speed. Precision, if you don't have that 90% on your helmet or you can't fit it in, I like to put it there. Enlighten, and then I put Ice Golem for increased accuracy and critical strike chance. Now, if you have issues with single target, you could swap your 6-link, your secondary 6-link for Mana Forge, Blast Rain, Storm Rain, Culling Strike, Frenzy, and Power Charge on crit. That will help for your single target, and you would replace your 4-link Mana Forge setup by Sniper's Mark, Mark on Hit, Blood Rage, and Steel Skin. Now, if you have your build and you ask yourself, how can I scale clear? Like, I want to make my clear better. The best way is to increase projectile speed. Tornado Shot fires the primary projectile, it shoots, and it blows up, and then it does secondary projectile. Those secondary projectiles have a time limit, so they exist for a certain amount of time. If your projectile speed is low, then they're gonna travel a smaller distance for that time than if it was faster, right? So if you really want to off clear, like you want to clear things that aren't even in your map, then projectile speed is the way to go. Herald of Ice is completely broken for mapping. I always run Herald of Ice for it. It's also, it looks nice, and a lot of people always ask me, can I run Herald of Ice because it looks good? Yes, but also it just helps for mapping. So it is actually a very good item. It's the best Herald for mapping. Orias End is very OP if you have the currency. I like to run Herald of Ice and Orias End. Like, the moment I shoot something, I fork, I do Herald of Ice, Orias End, everything on my screen just dies. Completely dies, and it's completely broken. So yeah, fork, chain if you want. If you deal a lot of damage and you don't want to go for single target DPS, you can change your ascendancy for, that chain. So you get that +1 chain plus that fork that you have. I think it's more than enough for your whole screen to die. Extra projectile obviously scales because it scales the secondary projectile as well. Well, it doesn't give more secondary projectile, but +1 primary projectile equals +4 secondary projectile. So that's just more clear. DPS obviously and attack speed helps. When you're running, if you have a high attack speed and you click your tornado shot, well, it's going to fire quicker, which means your screen is going to, die quicker. Flask effect really helps, right? Increased flask effect gives you the onslaught bonus, the quicksilver bonus, just everything is just better. Onslaught, as I was saying, does scale with flask effect. And if you have enough omniscience, replace one of your ring with Death Rush for that, adrenaline buff. Now, how to scale your DPS? Invest in your bow, okay? It's just 40% of your build should be just your bow. It's just completely broken. It's the strongest thing it's a bow build, right? You have a bow build, so you need a good bow. And whenever you're stuck, like, obviously don't only invest in your bow, but when you're stuck and you really don't know what to invest into and you have a lot of currency, just sell your old bow and just invest in your bow. Make sure you're 100% converted. Get enough Omni. I think 1,200 is the nice spot. Like 1,200, I wouldn't go higher, and I wouldn't, like, if I can, I wouldn't go lower. Accuracy needs to be 100%, okay? That is low-key one of the most important thing that people don't have. Why? Because accuracy gives you the chance to hit enemies, right? Let's say you have a 50% chance to hit enemies. That means your DPS is just cut in half. But don't forget, accuracy is the roll to hit the enemy, but it also re-rolls your crit chance. So if you have 50% accuracy and you have 100% crit chance, you will actually only have 50% crit chance. So now, not only don't you hit half the times, you crit half the times. So 50% accuracy equals 25% DPS. You basically lose 75% of your DPS because you miss half the times. So accuracy is completely broken. Next step is to get your crit 100% and then scale your attack speed, and you should be fine. Now, if you have any issues scaling DPS, please refer to my first ever video on YouTube. I spend 42 minutes explaining every single thing I use to scale DPS in my build. But this list is pretty much what you need. On that note, that closes the physical to gold conversion entry level guide. If you enjoyed, please let me know in the comments if you have any issues or if you want to give me feedback. I'm always open for it. We have a Discord that helps, hundreds of players every time. I think we're 5,500. I have a ton of helpers that actually help the players, and you also have me. We have guides, Atlas strats, crafting guides. All of that is in there. We have an awesome community. I will be making a bit more tornado shot videos. I will be making those crafting guides as well, so keep tuned to that. I'll be helping you guys for the continuity of your tornado shot. And yeah, so hopefully you have fun with your tornado shot, and I see you in the next video.